Chapter 21 of Almond-Blossom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Almond-Blossom by Olive WADSLEY. Chapter 21. What is the use of April? What the use of her wild dreams, unless you bear your part? The spring has let 1,000 voices loose, and shall not one find way into your heart? Gerald Gould. If Doro had longed for change of outlook, scene, surroundings, mental atmosphere, she obtained it. She had told Cavini of Tony's refusal to countenance her action in taking up a career, and the obvious sequel Cavini had foreseen. He had all the small Italian's commercial sense and lack of discrimination with regard to hotels. Later on, when Doro became famous, then. But for now, when no one was famous, and fees were still fond visions of a far future, why not a pension? He therefore repaired with his wife and Doro to one of those high houses in a meagre street in the wrong quarter of Paris, and there Doro began to train. To say she was disillusioned would be to describe the state of her feelings poorly. She was both crushed and infuriated by her surroundings, and secretly disgusted. She had, even though she would have denied it to herself, expected a certain glamour. She found dust and inefficient service, and cheap, greasy food instead, and ceaseless work, and endless chatter from Signora Cavini, who was none too pleased with her husband, and who went in deadly fear lest Doro should prove a failure. Another thing, no longer was Doro the spoilt and admired pupil. She was now Cavini's instrument, upon which he meant to play his way to fame. "My God, use your brain!" he would storm. "What are looks, a voice, even teaching such as mine, if you sing a burial song like the chorus of a vaudeville refrain? Open your mouth! Open your mouth! You are not drinking soup!" He too had his moments of doubt, and he took them out on Doro. No one wrote. Then, by chance, she met David Shropshire in the Rue de la Paix. In a moment his hat was off, his round, good-tempered face beaming down upon her. "I say, what luck! Come and lunch." They went to the Café Parisien, and Doro had the first good lunch she had eaten since she had left London, also the cleanest. Cavini had been peculiarly domineering that day. It was cold. Life seemed incredibly dreary. She looked at David with eyes which saw him most kindly. And she thought of Rex, who was David's type, insomuch that both were lean, clean mortals, with an air of pleasant distinction and very happy manners. In the old days she had thought David stupid. Rex had never been that, never could be. To-day, however, David's conversation had the agreeableness of novelty, after the Cavini's outpourings of complaints or mediocre gossip. He talked of the life Doro had known so well. She wondered a little shyly, and yet with real curiosity, if he would tell her again he loved her. He did not. Instead, outside, when he had hailed a taxi for her, he said gaily, "I suppose when the great night comes, I'll be admitted at the stage door, what?" Doro made some laughing reply. Definitely, quite surely she knew that in Shropshire's eyes she was different now, and that he would no longer allow himself to wish to marry her. She did not know how she knew, but she did. As it happened, she was quite right. At Christmas, Rex sent her a box of scarlet roses, which filled the pension with perfume, and asked if he might come to Paris. She wired back, "No." She spent the dullest half-year of her life, and was actually glad when Cavini announced that they would leave for his mother's home in Italy the following week. His wife and mother were lifetime enemies, and Signora Cavini showed a definite reluctance to acquiesce in this plan, which swept the pension like a tornado. There was, however, deep method in Cavini's madness. Averardo, the impresario, was at his villa convalescing, and that villa happened to be above the modest dwelling of Cavini's parents on the hillside at Fiesole. Cavini was a being subject to sudden attacks of a spiritually gambling nature, when he believed a certain thing would happen because he had thought of it suddenly, or had thought of it slowly. Any reason did which served Cavini's end. In this instance, he told himself Averardo would hear Doro by chance, be enchanted, and offer to place her. With that luck which attends few human foolishnesses, almost this very thing happened. Only Averardo saw Doro before hearing her. When he discovered the green-eyed vision to whom he had blown surreptitious kisses was the owner of the voice which roused his keenest commercial instincts, he could scarcely believe his own good fortune. He forgot gain, caution, his health, and bore down on the modest house of the Cavinis like a fat whirlwind. Doro was in the studio alone, and he kissed her at once, and thanked God she was alive. The Cavinis entered on this scene, and for the next 10 minutes the place was a pandemonium, in which Cavini smiled, Averardo beamed, Signora Cavini and old Cavini laughed and chatted together. Doro, at a shouted command from Cavini, sang a scale. Suddenly Averardo embraced her again, and this time she gently disengaged herself. He was quite Italian in his culinary appreciation, as well as his knowledge of music, and her own taste in food had remained so far severely Anglo-French. But the day was to be a gala, and it was celebrated accordingly. And all at once Doro found herself flattered by everyone, feted, acclaimed. It might have been a first night. She wished it had been. Thereafter she practised with Averardo, and he sent into Florence for the great Ortez to sing with her. In less than a week, the tiny operatic world in and about Florence had become Doro's setting, and she too began to call everyone Carissima. She too became accustomed to quick, meaningless embraces. At last the life began to claim her, and she forgot to be unhappy within herself. Averardo discussed the future with Cavini. He had not made a big fortune by altruism, nor by any other unworldly methods, and his knowledge of humanity was as great as his knowledge of music. "Spain, Madrid," he said, waving his manicured hand at Cavini. "The home land, the bird returning to her nest. What a draw to a sentimental nation! The little Freddie must advertise for us. The English have a sense of bringing anything to the notice of a would-be buyer better than any other nation. Only wait, you will see." Madrid did, at any rate, for that long-suffering town was placarded with posters in the national colours for weeks before Doro's appearance. She was billed as the new diva, under the name of Dolores, and her connection with the English aristocracy was not allowed to be ignored. Of course she was going to sing Carmen, and when she asked why, "Of course," Averardo laughed fatly. "All things are vanity," he answered reassuringly. "To be popular is better than to be eclectic. Only the conceited and very wealthy can afford to be that. The former because it does not matter what such are, the latter because it does not matter either in a different way. But to please you must possess the desire for universal oneness, though not quite in the sense our priests mean." He introduced Doro to the great racial doer, who extended to Doro first that gracious patronage an artist is able to give to a beginner in a different art, and later a very real affection. La divine Rachel, at 45, was no mean instructress of life. All that had colour, vividness, fire, any expression which counted, she had drawn towards herself. She was beautifully plain, a belle laid of great dangerousness, of most passionate emotions and subdued sensuality. Rumour granted her countless lovers. She had but one, and he had died. Of course the world did not believe in her faithfulness. Indeed, few people can believe that an intensely vivid emotionality can exist without indulgence in a headlong passion. Yet, paradoxically, most often the one bars out the other, for some emotionality springs, 9/10 of it, from a keen mentality, a mentality keyed up to perceive and accept the beautiful things in life, whereas passion can be roused by almost any means, many unbeautiful. The highest form of emotion breeds keenest criticism. Passion never leaves time to judge well or badly. Rachel gave the stage life to Doro, who ceased to feel self-conscious at last, and began to accept the new atmosphere with gaiety. On their way through Paris, Doro stayed at Rachel's appartement. It was bizarre, lovely, extravagant, and neat, all qualities possessed by Rachel's personality. There modern Paris met and adored itself and one another. There Rex came to see Doro. Rachel claimed him at once. She liked his fair debonair good looks, his mind. He was the one person Doro found who treated neither of them as if they were on the stage. She remembered David Shropshire had not done that. Tony, it seemed, never spoke of her. G often. "Ah, because you do," Doro said, with rather sad clearness of vision. She studied Rex as one does when suddenly an old friend is much admired by a new one. He made no least effort to talk of love to her now. She half wondered had he ever done so. It all seemed so far off now, and ineffectual somehow. On the last evening of Doro's stay, she was to leave the next day for Madrid. He took her to dine at Henry's. They were to go on to fetch Rachel at her theatre later. "Shall we drive into the country?" Rex suggested. "You won't be too cold?" Already climactic conditions had become a matter of great importance. He only drove out beyond Armenonville in the direction of Versailles. Beside the wood he stopped the chauffeur. "Let's smoke a cigarette here," he said to Doro. They strolled down a little winding path. Far away it seemed a great distance. The trees joined so often. The stars were shining. Rex lit a cigarette for Doro. Then, when she had smoked it for a moment, took it from her gently. Instinctively, Doro knew. "Do not spoil our happy time," she said shakenly. To her surprise, he gave a little low laugh. "Spoil it? Look at me, Doro." It was a challenge. She looked at him, standing straight before her, his face a pale blur in the dimness, but his eyes ardent, visibly shining. He took her hands lightly. "So you do not love me yet?" Doro met him in the same spirit. "Not yet." "There is someone else?" "No." "Thank God! Then I still hope," he said, always in that odd, gaily controlled voice, which gave the strangest effect of coldness and fervour mingled. "We ought to go," Doro suggested. "Not yet. A little longer. Just a little." He had not loosed her hands, but now he freed one of his own and deliberately drew her face to his. "You will in time," he whispered. He seemed to be smiling. Doro made no answer. She could not speak. A shyness had seized her, which angered her by its power. "Kiss me," Rex's voice asked. She shook her head, but her chin was still cupped in his hand. Then suddenly he kissed her. She could feel all the smooth hardness of his young face, and all the violent shakenness of his young strength. He released her gently, and said, panting between the words and yet in quite a tranquil voice, "To remember me by." They drove home, talking of ordinary things. At the theatre entrance, Rex said very quietly, "You will remember." End of chapter 21. Recording by mlcui. Chapter 22 of Almond-Blossom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Almond-Blossom by Olive WADSLEY. Chapter 22. Part 1. If once again before I die I drank the laughter of her mouth and quenched my fever utterly, I say, and should it cost my youth, 'twere well, for I no more should wait hammering midnight on the doors of fate. Trumbull Stickney. "It is really true," Doro said. She looked meditatively at herself in the glass. She had arrived. Definitely, surely. All the drudgery was past, the tedious preparation finished, the array of months, years, which had gone to make this one night, the scheming and foresight of Cavini and Averardo, the pension life, the practice. Somehow it did not, any of it, success or work or boredom or excitement, seem to matter vitally in this hour. Life merely meant going on being Carmen, or Mimi, or Julieta, or Elsa, or any other heroine whose type she was. The lethargy of over-excitement descended on her spirit like a pall. She sat in the flood of light, gazing abstractedly at herself, and seeing that other life at Hurst Point, at Ione's, and Pan. Work had made her forget. At least it had done its inevitable service. It had dulled her memory. How long ago, oh, how endlessly far away it was now, and yet to-night, recalling that time, she seemed to feel that ghost of a chill shudder of the soul which is experienced when one knows some hurt must come, which she had felt always there when memory had gripped her mind, as physically one waits for the recurrence of a pain, and at the first faint throb feels all one's body shrink away in terror. Still on her face there were the stains of art. Her eyes were lilac circled, her lips encarmined. She looked long at that face, gazing so steadfastly into her own. All the heavy days were over surely, and yet... At any rate, the morning held distraction and flowers and notes and press notices and interviews. The Ritz was besieged, and Doro answered to the call with a swing of the temperament which carried her to the other extreme of the night's sadness. Averardo puffed with complacency. That remark so dear to every one of us, "I told you so," was his to chant unceasingly. His urbanity was like a coat of many colours, each more suave and silky than the last, to each newcomer offering congratulations. Telegrams came from Rex and Rachel, from people she had known in town and met last at Ione's house, where their conversation had skilfully avoided the actual mention of Pan's death, whilst holding a note of challenge concerning Doro's actual participation in the whole affair. She had said then to Ione, "I wish you could be primitively natural to subtle people who cleverly suggest you are either immortal, a fool, or secretive. But you can't. It would be so absurdly melodramatic when you are insulted to get up and say all you feel and leave the house superbly. Simply, it isn't done. All that is left to you is to suggest that the oleanders are looking well, or ask your inquisitor if she has a cook still, or some other vital life question. And disliking them virulently afterwards doesn't do them any harm, or you any good, and that's so annoying too." Today, at any rate, she had no need to long to answer anyone. All the messages were unsubtle and admiring. Neither Ione, G, nor Tony wrote, however, and as Doro looked from the hotel window into the square below, a dazzle of heat and vista of emptiness at the siesta hour, the champagne sense of goldenness of life seemed to have deserted her again. Success had given her something, but not somebody, and she minded dreadfully. She was really lonely in her hour, despite the clamour of praise and eddying excitement. She tried to talk it out with Averardo, who, big and coarse in so many ways, had a soul which held no commonness, and who prevented her, by his protection, from applying the French red and white of stage life too literally. He patted her hand gently. "You were overtired. Some divas try hysterics. You grow cynical. You have the advantage. So have I. It is hard work calming the nerves. For you there is only discussion needed. I know, and what I do not know about women you could put in a flea's hand." "How dreadful for you!" Doro said. "No, not so. I like the learning. Nothing is so absorbing as temperament to watch, to exploit, to possess. Women who have not got it might as well be corpses for all of me. By temperament I mean the humour which has a cut in it, tears which can touch the heart, emotion which has beauty, passion which is headlong, splendidly heedless. Discreet voluptuousness in a woman is repugnant. No, temperament is a gift of the gods, and it makes women goddesses." He patted Doro again. "You have it sleeping." "I think it is dead, not sleeping," she said with assumed tragicness, which sounded whimsical, and added, "I hope so anyway." Averardo burst out laughing. "Dead! Ah, how I should laugh later at myself if I believed you, little one. As well say the stars die each night when they leave the sky. They depart, but they reappear. So will that sleeping temperament, when least you expect it. And again I shall have that glorious pleasure, the intense enjoyment of repeating, 'I told you so.'" "You are a dear, Averardo," Doro told him rather listlessly. He looked almost awkward, but he was delighted. A vast section of the public firmly believes stage managers and impresarios, anyone who holds a commanding position with regard to the commercial side of art, to be arch-villains, and the generally opulent appearance of these gentlemen rather adds to the impression of vice. Averardo bore out his claim to this sad title in every detail. He was big, florid, moustached, and diamonded. He wore coats with rich fur collars, and a hat of such shine that it cheered a rainy day. His bulk was great, his clothes greater. He looked vulgar, easy living, a happy libertine, and whilst he was, in point of fact, vulgar in some senses, he was in every other of primitive outlook. His humour might be broad, but his personal morality was narrow, and he enjoyed his reputation of a dog. It was far better than being one. He led 3 distinct lives: his stage life, in which he judged no one; his home life, where he possessed a husband's and father's privilege of judging every one at the top of his voice; and his private life, in which he enjoyed his own mind. He was of small bourgeois stock, and therefore a pleasant snob. And the fact that Doro had belonged to the family of a milord gave Averardo a very agreeable interest in her, which again induced in him a far more paternal consideration than was usually bestowed by him on his protégés. Of course it was said he was in love with her, but it was always said he was in love with his latest discovery. To the type of public mind which believed this sort of thing, no actress or singer could be moral, and every manager must be a Don Juan. "It is all so much more attractive for the box office," Averardo said comfortably. "Strange what virtuous people will pay to look at anyone they think gorgeously sinful, and yet refuse to add to their church donation for the restoration of the effigies of saints." Doro was finding life strange in other ways. She was appreciating the vast difference a background, lack of it, can make. At home, in town, she had been Tony's daughter. Here she was a singer who had been born in a caravan, or near one, and for the first time she encountered patronage. Later she parried or paralyzed it. At this time she was too inexperienced to deal with it, too hampered still by the tenets of the creed she had first worn. She discovered how graded artists can be, and she divined that, no matter how feted and flattered they may be, or how lavish their host's hospitality, they are never entirely within the circle. All her Hurst Point outlook felt aggrieved. She discovered herself to be nothing very much, and a little of everything, and it distressed her until, bored by herself, she suddenly dashed to the far extreme and began to entertain as all the opera world did. At a big supper party given in her honour, she met Savardi and instantly liked him. "Women always do," he said quite frankly. It was not possible to call him conceited. He merely acknowledged facts men and women hurled at him unceasingly in open admiration. The son of an Englishwoman and a Spaniard, the owner of a large private fortune, young, famous for his sporting skill, of immense physical strength, and an odd arresting mentality, Savardi had had too much of everything all his life. Miraculously it had not spoilt him as it might have done. He was too sure of himself, of course, but he would have had to have been an archangel or a nonentity to have withstood his fate. As he had never tried to do so, naturally he found it a pleasant one. He was 25 when he met Doro, and there was a rumour of a great match the church and his house were arranging for him. He fell in love with Doro at once. He had done it often before when a woman pleased him. He came up to her at the head of the horseshoe table, and with the very deftest mingling of politeness and trickery, got rid of her supper partner and seated himself in his place. Doro saw a big young man, whose very black hair made his blue eyes seem very light between their thick, short lashes, and whose mouth was charming. He looked so strong that he reminded her of Hercules. He had perfect manners and spoke English faultlessly when he chose. At the end of the supper he said tranquilly, "You are the loveliest thing I have seen, and I am going to have a tremendous affair with you. I will call upon you tomorrow, if I may." He came, armed with green orchids, which he gravely put into vases himself, explaining to Doro that servants had no flair in such matters. Then he sat on a silken cushion at her feet and kissed her hands almost reverently. She felt unembarrassed and amused, and rather liked Savardi. He made her conspicuous at once by taking the stage box for the season, and each night sending orchids of the same green and golden variety to her at the end of the opera. Of course she encouraged him. Only women of very little emotion, who are admired by dull men, fail to do so. Your normal woman simply cannot help encouraging a man, even when, from the very first, she is quite sure she does not and will never love him. It may be selfish, it may be cruel, but life is so constituted that each of us takes the gift we are offered. If we did not, we should go through days with about as much attractiveness in them as farm interests provide for the town habitué. By encouragement, one means not discouragement. Doro accepted Savardi's orchids, laughed at his wit, let him kiss her hands, and called him a dear thing and cher ami. It had not occurred to her that Spanish men have an iron control of themselves because they need it. Savardi found her passionately engrossing. He was quite mad about her, and attempted no disguise of the fact. His own people paid no attention to it. Naturally he must wander a little before settling down, and of course his prospective bride's relatives treated the affair in the same way. All the men had been similar, and many such experiences. Everyone expected it would cost Savardi a great deal. He was prepared to fling his fortune at Doro's feet. She drove him to the verge of frenzy. He could not understand her in the least. She was this opera singer. Night after night she appeared to a rapturous public, was one with the life, and yet when she received him, she was a different being entirely, and talked with him in such a way he could not talk with her in his way. The strain of this plain living and high thinking began to tell on him. He became thinner and, as a result, looked more attractive. He lost the fine animal look. It gave place to a certain rather pathetic, eager ardentness. "You play with fire," Averardo told her, most admiringly. No speculation in all his career had paid him so well as the launching of Doro, and Savardi's adoration was, to him, merely another attraction for the box office. He thought Doro quite realized her role in Savardi's, wherein he was wrong. To Doro, Savardi was merely what he was, a man in love with her, with whom she was not in love. Of course, the affair would end as it must. For the moment it was rather exciting. Until Savardi came to her dressing room between the acts. She thought he was pale, and said so. His looks had not suffered, but his air of supreme fitness was less evident. "I have a fever," he said slowly in English. Doro's dresser slipped out. It was a long entr'acte, and she had been bribed beyond all reason. Also she considered La Señorita an extremely lucky being, and Savardi was nearly as good as a saint to the people. He was so rich and good-looking and powerful. Doro had 5 visions of him in her winged mirror, and she thought carelessly for the nth time what a fine thing he was. He came forward and laid his hands on her shoulders. "Dolores, I love you." His voice was so controlled, so chillily respectful, that for the moment Doro felt actually amused. Then she looked up as she felt Savardi's long persistent gaze, and met his eyes. As she did so, the pupils expanded, covering all the blue, and in that instant she had a certain intuition that there was in him a force which other men had not in any such like measure, something which all the veneer of modernity, its influence, could neither conceal nor temper. His hands pressed harder as he said, "I love you as I love the saints." This again did not sound frightening, though Doro could not know Savardi had never yet loved any human saint, nor ever would. But in his mind, overwrought, tired out by his love, frustrated desire, the amazing uncertainty of the whole thing, religion and passion, the 2 major forces in a man of his upbringing, mingled inextricably. He bent lower. "Dolores." His breath stirred her hair, and she shivered a little. Ah! A long sigh escaped Savardi. At last! His hands slid lower and clasped her with an effect of steel-like gentleness. They touched her very lightly, but she could not escape from them. His voice, breaking with passion, reached her only faintly. My heart, my soul, I love you. You are like a flower of God. Only love me, and I will keep you blossoming on the altar of my love. Only love me. Always you look so cold, so much as if you possessed yourself. I cannot bear it any longer. I tell you I cannot. And he bent and kissed her. The youth, the romance, that strange inextinguishable wish to love, which is in each of us and leads so many of us to commit the foolishness of our lives, were stirred by that kiss. Doro's lips did not answer the kiss, but they received it, and every lover dares to hope from that. The moment died. Doro's will reasserted itself, and she felt inconsequently angry and almost humiliated. She rose with a swift movement. Savardi's arms went out to her. His impassioned, wilful young face implored her. Even in this moment Doro recognized his charm. She said lamely, intensely conscious of the crass ordinariness of her words, "Please, you must not. I should not have let you." A flash of intensely resentful amazement passed over Savardi's face. His blue eyes narrowed. He looked a long look at her, then went slowly forward, and as slowly put his arms about her. It was useless to struggle, but Doro strained away from him. He drew her back inexorably near to him again. A flood of Spanish words raced from his lips. His voice was pleading, stormy, adoring, masterful. At the end he said in English, "You shall." And at that moment he had never been more Spanish in his heart, more pitiless, savage, and headlong. He believed her scruples to be a pretence. He would not believe, as he had told her in vitriolic speech, that she could have seen him all these weeks, allow him to visit her daily, to kiss her hands, fetch her from the opera house in his car, and yet that he meant nothing to her. "You shall not," he said now, his face so white it looked painted, his blue eyes blackly blazing. "Also, you shall." And then deliberately, "You are no longer your own. You are mine." And he kissed her again, holding her crushed up against him. Between his kisses he adored her with most beautiful words. But Doro listened to none of them. She felt furiously humiliated with Savardi and herself, for the kisses stirred her, and his magnetism thrilled her, and she hated his dominion. Then she realized he was no longer speaking of love, but of Cordova, and she listened. She heard him tell her they two would go to his villa at Cordova. "It is so lonely, so lovely. The nightingales sing there so maddeningly, and the roses are like a sea, and the orange blossom. We will live there, you and I, you and I." His voice sank to a whisper. He pressed his face against her hair, kissing it. And clearly, most poignantly, and with bitter anger indeed, Doro realized he was not asking her to marry him. She did not love him, she knew that, but in that instant she resolved that he should love her so utterly, he should sacrifice everything for her. She would make him ask her to be his wife. She kissed him suddenly. As he drew back, half dazed by the new happiness of it, she said, "Come to me tomorrow at the hotel. Kiss me good night now." He kissed her amazedly, quite gently, and left her. He believed his battle won, and already he had lost it. He went home feeling the world was a toy which was his to play with. He was at Doro's hotel by 11, the green orchids in his hand, and as well a chain of emeralds by which the most virtuous woman must have felt tempted. In the so clear light he was an attractive creature, so black of hair and lashes, so healthily bronzed, and his charming mouth looked very happy. As Doro's maid closed the door, he took the floor in a stride and swept her into his arms, and kissed her for a full minute, then offered the orchids and emeralds. "Nothing could match the wonder of your eyes, but perhaps you will accept these poor offerings." He drew her down onto the sofa, and kept one arm about her. "It must stay there, please. Every bit of me is so afraid you may not be quite true, that you may vanish." In time they reached the subject of Cordova. "We will motor there," Savardi said gaily. "It will be divine. The road is bad, but quite lovely, darling." His voice grew lower, his eyes more ardent. "Dolores, when?" "At the end of the season," she said, smiling into his eyes. "It would be impossible earlier." "Nothing is impossible," Savardi declared vehemently. His wilfulness awakened instantly by the merest suggestion of a power before which he must give way. "Nonsense! A contract? Oh, I will settle Averado naturally. You shall sing the Mignon, and then "Après ça, le déluge," Doro murmured. He gazed at her with deep reproach. "One should not laugh at love. It spoils it a little always." Doro thought with cynicism, having grasped exactly where she and Savardi stood in relation to one another, that, for a man of his outlook, his other views were rather paradoxical. She did not in the least understand that Savardi was merely quite natural. He could not marry an opera singer. That she and he of course understood, but Dios, he could love one, and did. It was no question of morality at all, simply of custom. For a week Doro let him come. She accepted his gifts, which were quite exquisite. She took his kisses. She let him adore her. Then, since he still did not make the obvious suggestion, she prepared to hurt him. Again he was in her dressing room. He sat there every evening now during the longer entr'acte. Doro had been singing in Pagliacci, and stood before him in her ballet dress, tying a wreath of leaves upon her head. Savardi could stand it no longer. He sprang up and seized her in his arms. "You are so beautiful, I cannot bear it," he said in a choked voice. "I cannot explain. It makes me feel helpless and fierce at once to look at you. This cannot go on, Doro. Tonight." His eyes sank into hers. "Tonight?" she echoed. "Yes, what?" His eyes fell, his lips smiled against hers. "Jesus, Maria, and Jose," he murmured boyishly. "What does one say?" What he might have said just then, for he was a young man of no mean talent of speech, was lost for all time, for the dresser rushed in fussily, exclaiming noisily and incoherently. Behind her Tony entered. He advanced upon Doro with a quiet "Well, my girl," and as she clung to him silently he surveyed Savardi most directly. Savardi murmured his name, and Tony supplied his own. Savardi's eyes neither widened nor closed from stupefaction, and he kept his lips in a hard line, but his brain reeled a little. No contretemps could shake his self-possession. He made a young man's adieu to an older man, and bowed over Doro's hand. Then he went out to his own despair. Here was a complication which crushed even his passionate optimism. Of course he had heard Doro's history very early in their acquaintance, and certainly the Spanish part of it had confirmed him in his own views, made his procedure, indeed, far easier. He had believed and quite understood Doro's severance from her English friends. She was tout court an opera singer, and as such meet to be loved as he did love her, and intended to continue to love her. Lord Rexford's re-entry into her life changed everything. He saw that with desperate clearness, and also that Lord Rexford was, he had grasped that fact instantly, the man of all men with whom his suit, such as it had been, would stand least chance. He went to his father and mother, who were peacefully in bed, and with vehement gestures and tears in his eyes proclaimed his desperation. After endless discussion, bitterest anger on both sides, kisses of forgiveness, he did what he had meant to do when he had first entered his parents' room 2 hours earlier. He wrote a formal offer of marriage for Doro's hand to Tony, and added that he would do himself the honour of waiting upon Lord Rexford the following morning at 11. This letter he delivered at the hotel himself. Tony had inquired about him almost at once. That is to say, he had chosen a cigar, lit it, enjoyed it for a few moments, and then asked, And who is Don Luis de Savardi? Which of 'em?" "He's the only son." "Wants to marry you, I suppose?" Doro temporized. "He's in love with me." Tony nodded. "Wants you to become his wife, of course. I don't wonder." He looked with unconcealed distaste at the dressing-room. Indeed, he seemed strangely out of place in it. He gave Doro no reason for his amazing appearance, nor had she asked one. It was so wonderful that he had come. "You don't like it," he said bluffly. "All this smell and the heat and all that. You couldn't." "But I do. I love it in a way." "Good God!" said Tony, not in the least profanely. The idea seemed to stun him into silence for a little while. He sat smoking, his eyes roving, a hand on either knee. At last he said, "Why don't you marry him?" For one instant she thought he meant Rex, but he went on blandly. "Decent looking feller, sportsman and all that, I believe. Why don't you?" Doro had a malicious desire to be perfectly frank and say, "My dear, because he hasn't asked me, and never means to, unless he is forced to do so by my subtlety." But she could not hurt Tony in this hour, when he had just come, when it was so wonderful a thing he should have come. "Don't let's talk about Savardi," she said swiftly. "Tell me everything, everything, darling. How were Rex, G, the horses, home?" "Oh, all right," Tony answered. "G's been a bit seedy, but then hang it all, as Walter's told her, time flies. Can't expect to race with the 2-year-olds forever, you know." He jerked his head towards the theatre. "I was in there all the time, listening to you." His gaze grew keener. "I'd as soon hear you in the drawing-room at home, Doro." "Oh, my dear Tony, darling, don't you see?" "We won't talk about it yet." Tony agreed with that obvious magnanimity we use about a small thing, in order to prepare the way for a real demand, in the hope the listener may be lured into a readier state of acceptance. "Early days to discuss affairs yet, eh?" A funny little grin, which had an element of both bravado and sheepishness, deepened the lines round his mouth, as he watched Doro making up. "Things don't change much," he said. "En revient toujours?" Doro suggested, her green eyes suddenly brilliant with amusement. One of Tony's foibles was a pretended aversion to any language save his own. "English is good enough for me, and you can find a place today, don't care where it is, where someone won't understand it." And now he merely stared. But it was evident that if he could not grasp each word, certain sentiments curiously applicable to certain conditions borne out by Doro's remark had filtered through his brain. "Lot of flowers," he remarked. "Oh, one is rather spoilt." "I believe you, my dear. You'll spare this evening to sup with me?" "I'd break every engagement ever made to do it, darling." He was genuinely pleased, he said bluffly, expressing his gratitude after his own manner. "Of course, later, one sees a thing differently." Doro, perfectly accustomed to doing mental detective work of higher order in connection with Tony's conversation, grasped, after a moment's lightning research, that this was the amende honorable for having parted from her so bitterly. She went to him and knelt before him, her tulle skirt billowing out, and laid her hands on his knees. She looked very young in that moment. "Dear Tony," she said gently. Averardo burst in at that moment, and burst out laughing. He stood in the doorway, rocking to and fro, all his diamond studs palpitating like so many miniature suns, his rings glowing as he waved his hands. When he had really finished his laugh, he apologized for it as heartily in Italian. Tony sat on, surveying him with a stare beside which the salt conversion look of fame would have seemed an inane smile. Averardo's class and type to him were people and nothing else, and his outraged gaze, after resting on Averardo's somewhat unusual ornaments, travelled to his face and stayed there implacably. Doro nervously mentioned his name, and Averardo at once bowed from left to right, Tony was recovering from this shock when Rizzini, the contralto, rushed in and embraced Doro. She was an immense woman, immensely corseted and perfumed and uncovered. Tony surveyed her with much the same repugnant interest one bestows upon a mandrill or a freak. He rose, and muttering to Doro he would join her later, went back to his seat. Averardo and Rizzini had had their uses, however. Tony felt a comfortable conviction that Doro could not wish to live in such surroundings, and that his plea to her to return might not fall upon such unheeding ears. He had found life unbearable without her. He longed for her to be back, or, failing that, he longed for her to marry. The contemplation that she might continue to lead this life was infinitely distressing to him. Rex and G and he seemed sometimes to be like dim marionettes jerking in time to a scheduled existence. There was no life in them. Rex was in town a great deal, and then G and he faced one another in the silence. After a particularly bad week of that existence, he had risen and said abruptly, "I am going to Madrid." G had replied, "Good," and he had caught the early boat train. He had felt extraordinary when he had stepped out at the frontier. For an instant the years had seemed to fall away, and he was back in the olden golden days, giving Francesca's maid directions, arguing about the car. There were the same customs officers, clad in opera bouffe style, and the same military policemen in their absurd high hats, the same women with nasal voices, walking up and down, offering croissant sandwiches and bowls of coffee and apricots. Nothing had moved him so much as that revival of memory, or brought Doro so near. He had once carried her in his arms across this very line. Even the dusty heat of Madrid, where the noise of the trams seemed to penetrate even to his room in the august hotel, the absence of all that which he considered alone made life bearable, could not drive that feeling of tenderness from his heart. He dined early, and went straight to the opera house and sat well in his loge. The burst of wild applause when Doro appeared had shaken him a little, but reconciled him not at all. The stage was not meant for the right sort of woman. Anyone could see that, in Tony's opinion. He only marvelled that Doro had not already done so. His prolonged inspection of her dressing room, its smallness, heat, excessive light, the photographs all signed "Yours ever," and inscribed "To Dolores Darling," the idiotic mascots of black cats, heather horseshoes, old nails, and other equally incomprehensible and valueless trifles, the clutter of things everywhere, and the perfume of grease paint and strongly scented flowers, and Doro's beloved jasmine, had all combined to make Tony feel no human being could live in such an atmosphere and like it. He went to the casino restaurant and ordered the best supper he could devise, and sat outside the stage door in his hired car, patiently waiting. Doro flashed out to him in a cloak which had a wonderful green lining, where silver birds sang ceaseless strains. She too was excited. She too had been roused by tender memories. And then Tony's appearance, his claim to her, had given her back that sense of belonging rightly. She tried to be amused by her own outlook, but it was a little difficult. Finally she decided, "It isn't that I mind other people not being up to standard. It's that I do hate their not wishing to recognize that I am." Yet when Tony pleaded, quite eloquently for him, that she should chuck it all and come home, the lure of her new life seemed to grow in strength and fascination. She could not give it up. She knew it quite suddenly. Simply she could not. She adored the applause, the outward and visible sign of her value. Her power was a never-ceasing joy to her. She evaded a direct answer, and Tony thought, "Give her head." It was his modus operandi with any troublesome plunger. Savardi's note pleased him. He awaited that conqueror's coming with interest. Upon closer inspection, he decided Savardi pleased him mightily. He was a young man after his own heart. He detected no subtlety in him. He saw only a well-built youth who ardently wished to marry Doro, who possessed a name, an income, and could undoubtedly ride and shoot, and would be a great help to him in both those vital matters. Savardi thought to himself, "He will suspect nothing. He's comfortably stupid. Thank God he came early enough." He had passed a hideous night, cursing himself his bad start. Rexford cheered and encouraged him. There remained Doro. "She's lunching here," Tony volunteered. "Stay too." Doro entered, looking less like a prima donna than any woman could do. She was in white, and was wearing a white straw hat and no jewels, save Tony's string of pearls. "Well, my dear," Tony said, kissing her, "here's a visitor for you." Doro lifted her lashes at Savardi, and his heart raced. He went very pale. When Tony had strolled off to get some cigars, he paled further. He looked all black and white pride and obstinacy. He knelt before Doro suddenly. "Today I have asked Lord Rexford for your hand in marriage, Doro." He stopped because, literally, he dared not speak. But he kept his eyes fixed on her. She saw his lips trembling. And unexpectedly she felt sorry for him. She had meant this to be a moment of triumph, and suddenly the wish deserted her. Savardi whispered almost inaudibly, "Mother of Christ, how I adore you." It must have been a prayer, but Doro knew it was not, and oddly, in that moment, Savardi seemed very boyish and appealing. Perhaps he saw the softening in her eyes. He leant nearer and slid an arm about her very gently, and then, like a tempest breaking from clear skies, he kissed her with such passion that she felt as if she must faint. The kiss grew less dominant, the breath struggled in her throat. My answer, she heard Savardi saying, and his voice was as shaken as if he had been running. "Open your eyes, my darling dear." And there followed a torrent of adoring Spanish. And his voice, so eager, so full of worship, stirred her. She could not help it. It was so sweet to be loved again, even if she did not love, and to have won. Conquest is such a balm to any hurt, and Savardi... And she had been lonely too, after all. "My beautiful, mine, Savardi stammered, and suddenly leant his face down on their hands clasped together. And somehow it became impossible to say no, though she knew that only the wonder of the moment held her, Savardi's demanding, splendid, insistent youth. He lifted his head and smiled at her, and said, with that swift swerve of mood which has its own attraction, "I had no idea one could wish to be married until you came." Doro looked into his blue eyes between their thick lashes. "You have relatives in the church, the diplomatic?" she asked him gravely. "But of course." His eyes did not drop. His outlook had been so far removed from hers that he entirely failed to appreciate the fact any rebuke had been intended. He knelt up now, and took Doro wholly in his arms and kissed her, as she told him later, breathlessly, rather too Spanishy. He laughed into her eyes. "I will kiss you à l'anglaise," and he touched her cheek chillily with his lips, like that. He stayed to lunch, he stayed to tea. Doro and Tony were to dine with him on the morrow in his home. Neither Doro nor Tony had realized what a Spanish engagement can mean. They were initiated into its first mysteries during the ensuing week. End of part 1 of chapter 22. Recording by mlcui. Chapter 22 of Almond-Blossom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Almond-Blossom by Olive WADSLEY. Chapter 22. Part 2. Savardi, however, Tony liked better and better. No lover, be it known, is so circumspect, so chivalrous, so definitely correct as your Spaniard. And all that the unsuspecting Tony found entirely right and pleasing. He was aware, though neither Savardi nor he had really discussed the matter, that, upon her marriage, Doro would have to give up her opera life. In Tony and Savardi's opinion, those events would follow one another in true Shakespearean manner, as the night the day. If Savardi had any doubts on this matter, he said nothing of them. He paid Doro assiduous court. He kept her in a whirl of life which seemed all sweetness, adoration, adulation, lovely gifts. She was feted by everyone. Rexford's presence had given her new prestige. Savardi and he accompanied her everywhere, and her progress in public places might have been that of royalty, for the interest it excited. Doro did not think, would not let herself think, deliberately, as it is perfectly possible for any woman to do. She let herself be swayed by Savardi's insatiable youth and love. Her life for the last 2 years had been desolate in her heart. Savardi had forced a way in, and if he had not lighted the lamps on that altar, those from his heart flung a far reflection on to hers. Women have married for less. Doro, at least, loved the gaiety and quickness of him, his intense virility, as women generally do love precisely those qualities because they stir their pulses, and, at any rate, move life from its ordinary rut. Secretly, Doro fully intended continuing her career. She foresaw the struggle, and she ardently hoped it would take place before her marriage. Struggles after were apt to be half and half victories on either side, she had noticed. A remark of Savardi's made late one night, when he was endeavouring to kiss her good night, a feat which seemed likely to be accomplished towards early morning, awoke her from her trance-like laissez-aller frame of mind. He was sitting on the sofa, holding her in his arms, and kissing her quite gently, and he said, his lips against her hair, "Dios, life is very hard, difficult. I wish that I might shut you up forever, so that no one might gaze upon your beauty but myself." He was quite serious. His blue eyes burnt with longing. "I should stifle, my soul would, leading a life like that," Doro said. He put a cool hand upon her throat. "But we should belong so. All of you would be mine." "Ah, we should belong?" Remembering, she felt a chill of dread. The struggle no longer loomed. Partly worrying, partly amusing, it would be a thing of deadly seriousness. It was useless to look to Tony for any help. She knew his views. There remained to break her engagement. Averardo broached the question to her. He had contracts with her which had still 5 years to run. "Of course I shall fulfil them," Doro told him, "but naturally." Averardo was enchanted to hear it, also amazed, but the latter emotion he hid. Nor did he mention to Doro that Lord Rexford had asked him, much as an enemy offers armistice, what price he required to break those contracts. The last week of the season dawned in a blaze of heat, and bullfights and festas of every description, and with it there dawned Rex, quite cool, as languid as ever, and self-possessed. He certainly made a foil for Savardi, with his fairness and languor, his low, always it seemed, slightly amused voice, and utter lack of gesture. "So it is true?" he asked Doro. He studied her. "And you are as happy as you want to be?" "Is anyone ever that?" she asked him a little sadly. She wished Rex had not come. Somehow his coming seemed a reproach, and yet there was nothing about which she need feel self-reproach. Savardi and he were polite to one another. Savardi divined all he would never know, and his divination gave him little peace where Rex was concerned. And Rex appropriated Doro so calmly. He was always in her dressing room, at the hotel, driving her, riding with her. Savardi neither liked nor understood his type. To him it appeared bloodless and self-sufficient. Rex had none of his tastes and few of his views, and yet seemed to have lived a great deal, and certainly he was no fool. Again, Rex's friendships were extraordinary. He appeared actually to like the robust and pushing Averardo, who treated him, Savardi noticed, with no effusion, and yet would do things for him he would never do for other men, Savardi included. Only Savardi's sister, Renee, raved about him and his fairness, and his smile, and his voice. Doro suspected Rex of a ridicule he did not show. She taxed him with it, and he denied it with a little smile. "Do you like Savardi?" Doro asked him. He met her gaze levelly. "Of course I am consumed with jealousy of him. I think he's a sportsman, and his manners are delightful, but one appreciates the mixture of savagery and haute finesse which distinguishes him." Savardi and he went to the big bullfight, to Doro's amazement and disgust. He was in Tony's sitting room when she went there to seek Tony. "You're back?" she asked. "Yes. Savardi was entertaining a crowd, but I preferred to come home." "Did you like it, the fight?" "No, I loathed it." "Why did you go then?" She was genuinely surprised. Rex opened his eyes. They had been closed. He was lying full length on a sofa, his hands clasped behind his head, and said "Savardi asked me, hoping I would refuse. So I went." "But why? It sounds so absurd." "Oh, he understands quite well." A storm was coming up. The sky was livid orange, flecked with purple clouds. The trees shivered. "How still it is," Doro said. "Yes, the hush before a tempest. Forced calm is always a portent." He looked at her fixedly. "Doro." "Yes." "When is your marriage?" "Heaven knows." "It may, possibly does. But will that fact content Savardi? It would not me, does not, in point of sordid fact. There are such things as trains and boats, you know, in connection with a return trip." "You are going back?" Doro asked obviously. "Of course." "Rex, that curiosity a woman never quite loses with regard to a man she knows has loved her, made her question him, even while she realized her unwisdom and perhaps lack of kindness. "Rex, why did you come?" "The better to see you, my dear," he said, smiling a little. "Ah, just that." Her voice sounded flat with disappointment. "I wanted to see what kind of a man Savardi was, if he'd take care of you." "And you think he will? You approve?" "He's a decent being with very obvious limitations, and they are better than subtle, hidden ones." A smile quivered on Doro's lips. She thought of Savardi's first attempt to win her. Was he so unsubtle? And what would Rex have said had he known? She felt glad he never would. Rex asked suddenly, "Do you intend to go on singing after your marriage? One imagines not. It's rather difficult to imagine Excellentissima giving full vent to Delilah's passion-broken cry." Doro went across to the sofa and stood beside it, and looked down at Rex. "Rex, what shall I do? I don't want to give up my career." "No, I know, but I fear you will have to. The fact you do not wish to will alter very little." She felt hurt by his impersonal tone of lightness, and chose to retaliate. "Savardi adores me," she said. "In his way," Rex answered very quietly. "But unluckily, loving you his way will not give you yours. It never does. One has to love a person more than oneself to be able to do that. However," he sat up and drew out his cigarette case, "you can give up your way." Doro turned and sat down on the sofa close to him. "Oh, Rex," she said helplessly. He rose and walked to the window, and lit his cigarette there. Doro looked at him silhouetted against the dangerous glow of the sky. His profile stood out with a sort of hard determination, and suddenly it occurred to her that virility is not always super evident. It might exist under self-repression, and exist the more intensely therefore. The excitement which a coming storm always can induce awoke in her. Rex was too self-controlled. His aloofness made her resentful. He had not always been so very still and repressed and apart. If he had not come, life really would have been easier. His coming had not made her love Savardi more, exerted the influence the return of one old lover can exert. Rex had simply formed a contrast, and her mood was too variable to desire any further agitation. Savardi came in, and saw Rex first. His blue eyes glittered. Then he kissed Doro, and talked with her in the tone young men like to use to their womenkind, a tone of voice which, if it had been addressed to children, might be described as soothing, and as addressed to a woman deserves the adjective soft in its least polite sense. Rex continued to stare out of the window at the darkening street, the low bending trees, and lifting awnings. The air felt as if there were no wind, and yet all things moved in a frightened, hurried way. Savardi wished to God in his own mind that Rex would go, and continued to murmur to Doro. He was intensely wrought up. The bullfight had lit its usual excitement in him. Much excellent champagne had not tended to lessen that effect. He wanted to kiss and kiss Doro, but this man stood there in priest-like inactivity. "You like the fight, Señor Greville?" he inquired suddenly. "Oh, yes, thanks." "You approve of our sport, then?" "But why not, Don Luis?" Nothing to be gained that way. The hour dragged. At last Savardi left, just before the storm broke. "I cannot drive to the opera house in this," Doro said, watching the hailstones beat the street. "It would be impossible. Heavens, Rex, what an irritating thing life is." As he still did not speak, she said, a little nervously, laughingly, "I think I want to be comforted." The words took them back to Hurst Point, to the old life. "Rex, I'm so uncertain." She longed for him to question her. He said levelly, "You are engaged, you know. No one forces that sort of thing on one." "Circumstances do," Doro answered sombrely. He would not look at her. His steady eyes gazed reflectively at the sodden road. Suddenly Doro demanded, "What did G think of my engagement?" "Oh, she hoped you'd be happy, and so on and so forth." He smiled at her. "G was quite as she should have been." He spoke with a double truth, one half which was heard only personally for G had taken it well for both Doro and himself. She had not questioned Doro's choice. She had certainly wished her every happiness, and she had clasped Rex's head between her fine withered hands, and drawn it down to her shoulder. If he had felt, reading the letter of announcement, that all the glow and romance of life was ended, she had felt for him, through him, as if life had ceased to have any value. If his love for Doro had been of the stocky, used kind, the kind which may begin in earliest youth, and settle down from lack of ambition on the part of the lover to a state of well-wishing, well-being, placidity, she would have been sorry for his disappointment, but not broken by it at all. But she knew that some men are so constituted that one love may fill their lives to the exclusion of all else, and that by the possession of the woman they love alone will they attain happiness. Rex had been no anchorite, but he had never spoken of any woman with love save Doro. G knew him through and through, knew his passion for beauty, the subtlety of his mind, his deadly obstinacy. These three things had all fused in his love for Doro. "I will have the best or nothing," he had once told G doggedly. It had been she who had advised him to go to Madrid. He had meant to go, she divined, and she had made the way as easy for him as she could. Now he was there, and that was all that could be said. Doro's engagement endured. He would make no appeal. He recognized Savardi's defects and virtues, and knew him to be as much in love as his nature would allow him to be with one woman at one time. He saw Doro did not love him, and yet would marry him, unless someone deliberately stopped her. He realized with austere clarity that he should return to England. He approved Savardi's dislike of himself, and despised himself for exploiting it. This evening he knew he must not stay. If Doro did not love Savardi, neither did she love him, and his presence confused her power of concentration. He said, "I'm going back tomorrow, my dear. In this weather I prefer Hurst Point." "You are going tomorrow?" Doro said. Her heart sank. "Oh, why?" "Lots of reasons. Chiefly, I want to." The room was nearly in darkness. They could see one another's faces in a pale blur. "Don't go," Doro said. She crossed to him and laid her hand on his arm. It's been so splendid having you. Savardi doesn't like me, but is nice about me. Is that what you are going to say?" he interpolated. "He does like you." "My dear, he does not, nor I him." "How absurd! And anyway, if it is so, why?" Rex wondered if women were deliberately cruel, or merely nervously so. He felt a hard inclination to take Doro's hand tightly in his own and crush it into his and tell her, "Because we both love you. Because he suspects I do, and I know he does. Because I hate to see him touch you, hate to think of the hours he can kiss you, hate him for being first when it is not my fault I am not, and just chance luck. Call it what you will, and I hate him because it makes me dishonourable to myself." Instead he said, "Simply, we don't hit it, although we are both rather nice people in our different way." He clung to any form of humour, went on talking in the same vein to escape the tension he felt threatened. Never since he had come to Madrid had he felt so utterly stirred as he felt now. Never had Doro striven so to reach him. The storm was sweeping his nerves too. The room grew even darker. He knew if he did not go that he would later not forgive himself. He longed with a parched sensation of driven longing to break down the frail barrier between himself and Doro, and implore her to free herself. He longed to tell her of the sleepless nights and weary days he had lived through for love of her. Just this quiet intimacy was a danger in itself. He made himself say nonchalantly, "I must be off, my dear. I'll come round in the morning, if I may, to say good-bye." He did not attempt to take her hand. He reached the door and switched on the light, and looked back at her. "Au revoir, then." He closed the door, and stood alone in the vast corridor. That deadly ache born of the knowledge of chance foregone, a meeting he had longed to last, ended, seized on him. He asked himself the questions one does ask futilely. Why had he not stayed just a little longer? Why had he been so unnecessarily off-hand? He had not wished to go in reality, and with every thought and instinct he longed to return to Doro. The dimly lit corridor looked like the dreary entrance to any place of repentance. It was stamped with unoriginal neatness and worth. How banal to leave all your heart's happiness in such a hotel, to part from everything which made life beautiful in one of those over-furnished, garish little rooms. Rex realized the power to hurt which, speaking ordinarily, things can possess. He walked away and down the wide, thickly carpeted steps. Outside it had stopped raining for a little while, but the sky hung low like a dark menacing wave about to break. Lightning cut into it with streaks of silver fire. No thunder followed, but the air seemed to suffocate itself, it was so dense, so heavy. Rex walked out and crossed the square. An acacia tree in front of him suddenly bowed, as if a violent hand had pulled it downwards, and at the same moment a second storm burst. He ran, still limping a little, to the first shelter he saw, a faintly lighted oblong. He pushed blindly at it, and found a half-opened door, and slipped in. Voices sounded indistinctly. Someone laughed, a man. Someone sang. Rex, his eyes becoming used to the dim light, discovered that he must be in the private entrance to the Café du Nord. Dimly he could hear a band. He seemed to remember the location too. The rain fell in a deluge. He decided to stay where he was, and walked forward and sat down on the linoleum-covered stairs. The room on the top landing was obviously occupied by rather happy revellers. Bursts of song were interrupted by roars of laughter. Rex remembered the bullfight, and understood this otherwise unnaturally early celebration. He lit a cigarette. It seemed extraordinary that tomorrow at this time he would already be so far away. It seemed extraordinary simply because he would be acting directly against his wishes, even his will. He had never loved Doro as he loved her now that he and she had both savoured life apart. Her newness at this reunion had been an added delight. It had seemed to give her an added charm, or perhaps to make all the other qualities he so loved in her more wonderful. He tried to think what he would do with life, how he should pass the time which loomed so menacingly before him now. Time became an enemy with every advantage, when you loved and were not loved again. One might struggle, deny, pursue one's interests vehemently. One did not escape. He supposed he would go back to London and stay there, and read of Dolores in the papers, and hate Savardi as much as ever. For deep down he hated him, and though the origin of his motive was obscure, he knew it resulted in contempt. He despised him for some quality he could not place in him, but at the same time he felt he was never wholly just to Savardi because of his jealousy. And at that moment, oddly, he heard Savardi's voice. He was shouting a name, Doro's. Rex flushed in the dusk. Young cub, he is drunk, of course. Another voice shouted clearly, "To the marriage day!" Apparently there was a vast filling of glasses. Rex rose and prepared to leave. He had reached the door when another voice, young, rather thick, reached him easily. "Never meant to marry the fair Dolores, only her father insisted." Oaths, shouts, laughter, expostulations broke out. Rex, strung up by the day's demand, took the stairs in a couple of strides and opened the door of the room. Savardi and a youth were struggling together. Half a dozen other young men were cursing and laughing, and endeavouring to separate the combatants. As Rex entered, the youth broke free. His face was bleeding where Savardi had struck him. He spat out venomously. "It is the truth. All our family knows it is the truth. All Madrid knew Luis would not marry an opera singer. He had arranged to take her to his villa at Cordova. My father saw the settlements. Then this Lord Rexford appeared." His friends had been restraining Savardi. Now one whispered Rex's name, and Savardi spun round, and they faced one another. Into Rex's mind, rocking in a very tempest of white rage, the thought slid, like a sliver of ice. Now I know why I distrusted him. He walked across the floor and stood within a foot of Savardi. They were of even height. Their eyes met levelly. For a moment neither moved. Then Rex, lifting his hand, struck Savardi lightly in the face, smiled at him faintly, and drew back. Savardi laughed in his throat. His friend, Miguel Martinez, stepped forward, bowed to Rex, and proffered a card. He began a set speech in Spanish. Rex took the card, tore it in two, and, still staring at Savardi's chill white face and burning eyes, struck him again, lightly, as before. Savardi closed with him, and he had the soul-satisfying feeling of having his enemy at grips at last. The élan which succeeds rage possessed him. He was lifted entirely above his earlier mood, and felt an amazing lightness. Neither man spoke, and there was silence in the close, crowded room. Savardi nearly swung Rex clear once, but a moment later Rex deliberately thrust Savardi off his feet, and by sheer appalling effort beat him to the floor. As he did so, he felt his weak side stabbed by a hideous pain. A haze floated before him, but through it he could see Savardi on the floor still. He gave a little laugh, and mechanically stooped to offer his hand to the fallen man. Others ran forward. He turned away and walked to a dusty mirror, set in tarnished gilt, with bunches of paper flowers at the four corners, and fastened his collar and tied his tie meticulously. Then, still upright, he walked out of the room and down the stairs. It had stopped raining, and he felt vaguely thankful for the momentary coolness. He was in such pain that he could scarcely think coherently. He knew he must reach his hotel, but he did not remember which way he went. A tram clanged past and stopped. He reached it, murmured the name of the hotel, and heard the man answer, watched him wave his hand energetically, and realized he was quite near it. He managed to gain his room. His man was there putting out his dinner clothes. Rex said to him, collapsing on the bed, "Get a doctor, the best, and don't let a soul know, not his lordship. Do you see? Go now, and be as quick as you can." Martin adored him. He was back with the doctor within 5 minutes, a little fat man, who was not quite innocent of the perfume of garlic, but who, the porter had informed Martin, was as clever as the devil. He examined Rex, and his sharp face grew sharper. In the end he took out a syringe and gave Rex an injection. "I leave tonight on the Paris express," Rex said to him quietly, freed from the pain. "If you can manage it, I should be glad if you could accompany me to Paris." The doctor stared. Then his heavy jowl quivered with anger. "You do not," he argued dogmatically. Rex winced with weariness. "Oh yes. Can you come? or do you refuse?" "You understand, you will be in great pain each inch of the way. You need absolute rest. Scarcely a movement?" the doctor inquired with seeming relish. "Oh, yes." "You may think you are a brave man, but I shall be a braver if I go," the doctor said glumly. But he was poor, and he was well aware this Englishman was rich. All the English appeared to be four things: rich, pig-headed, conceited, and without religion. Martin and he carried Rex into the train, and the doctor sat beside him in the stuffy wagonlet. Rex kept his steady, tired eyes fixed on the sky. Morphia had never dulled his mind, nor made him sleep. He had sent Doro and Tony a note, saying he was leaving by the night express, and that had been all. He seemed to feel nothing now but the pain, and a certain gladness that he had beaten Savardi. His mind could not struggle with the reason for the fight. He needed its balance to help him keep physical control of himself. In Paris he bade Espada good-bye, and sent for a man he knew well, a young Frenchman who had been his friend at Oxford, and who was mad on surgery and science. He bandaged Rex, and took him to his own house, and talked to him of his loves and work, and much of science, and more emotion. Rex bore his kindness for a week, then, swathed like a mummy, cursed for his foolishness with every good French curse known to his infuriated and devoted doctor. He left for London and his own home. He was fond of the town house in his way. He liked its cool spaces, its view of St. James, its intimate association with all things which had passed, but passed with dignity. It was too big a place, of course, and very darkly furnished, but it was home and his own, and he longed with almost passionate ardour for a little peace in his own country. His bedroom overlooked the Green Park, now the haunt of the happy loiterer, and he used to lie and watch the first leaves drift down as the hot sun kissed them loose. He wondered, as every one does at some time or another, generally during unhappiness, how many of the passers-by were glad or miserable, what loveliness or tragedy had touched their lives. He was not lonely at this time. Degree's report on his injured back, Hume's grave verdict after the examination, the constant pain, made him at once too depressed and tired to mind much who was with him or away. But when, as it seemed, miraculously, G entered his room one late summer afternoon, he knew he had missed her all the while. She was in black muslin and pink roses, a frivolous sunshade. All black chiffon and roses had replaced the ebony stick. Real roses were pinned in her corsage, by very real diamonds indeed, and all about her there hovered the sweet fragrance she affected, which Rex had loved so as a little boy. She stood beside his couch and smiled down at him. "Well, well," said she in that caressing little voice women use to their children when they have hurt themselves. "How did you hear I was back?" Rex asked. "I met Sir Keith at a garden party affair, and he told me everything except the bits you will tell me later on." Sweet, aged and funereal, came in to remove her mistress's things, and incidentally to give herself the tremulous joy of commiserating with Rex. "Indeed, you do look badly, sir," she said with gloomy respect. "Worn to a shadow, cruel thin, if I may say so. I suppose, sir, the doctor thinks it'll be a long job." "Years, sweet dear," Rex replied instantly, "if indeed I ever regain my former briskness." Sweet murmured scripturally about giving and taking away, then roused herself to give a spirited account of an illness, similar to Rex's it seemed, which had been suffered by a member of her own family, and had run a course of such serious nature that it had included every known ailment, the sufferer, however, succumbing to none till old age had taken its toll. "Cheery outlook," Rex commented, enjoying Sweet immensely. He felt quite different already. He had never realized he wanted G, but now that she had come, he knew he had, unconsciously, missed her all the time. Simply her presence, the familiar perfume she used, her low yet crisp voice, the sense of individuality she gave to a room, which is so great a gift and possessed by so few people, served to create an atmosphere of pleasurable contentment. He forgot his back, Madrid, the longness of the day. Martin came in smiling. Flowers, which Rex had been too dispirited to ask for, appeared magically. Tea boasted special cakes. G, secretly intensely distressed by Rex's pallor, his obvious weakness, decided instantly that she would stay in town indefinitely. She dispatched the outraged suite to Pointers with instructions to return accompanied by Nick, the terrier, and such garments as she and Sweet would need. In her own old room, which she had occupied as a girl, she lay down to rest for a while. Naturally, she was consumed with anxious curiosity as to the reason for Rex's illness, his abrupt departure from Madrid. Age had been kind to her. G often acknowledged that, in so much that it had detracted nothing from her mentality, and had added to it a very temperate philosophy, but philosophy very seldom takes rank with love, and G's love for Rex was the dominant factor in her life. She cursed Doro's entry into the family in her mind, since Rex had suffered by it. She remembered the November evening, years before, when Doro had seemed a being of cool yet flamboyant youth, and Rex had spoken first of her loveliness. She, G, should have foreseen then, but she had trusted to the value of propinquity, which breeds so wholesome a familiarity. She admitted now to herself that she had entirely failed to discount the influence one love may have in awaking love. She had ignored the strange, yet often inexorable effect the mere fact of love being felt by one person may have quite unconsciously on another nature, seeming to attract as if by an invisible aura, exerting an involuntary spell by reason of its own intensity. Now she knew that, in all probability, had Pan and Doro never loved, Rex might not have cared. Doro, until that new aspect of her had been presented to him, would have remained the being of close dearness and no more to Rex. But it had happened, and regret was futile. Lying here in the room, which had once watched her own hour of storm, her thoughts moved slowly to her own youth. People said age forgot, failed to sympathize because it had grown out of touch. Today she remembered, as if it had been yesterday, the anguish of those summer months when she, like Doro, had loved a man of straw. She felt herself a ghost of herself, gazing pitifully at her own anguish. Ah, age forgot nothing, and when it still loved, it only suffered anew in the sufferings of the one it loved. By the memory of her own grief, she knew Rex's pain. She dined with him in his room, and later they sat in the darkness lighted only by the reflection of lamps from the park. The trees rustled softly, sighing for relief that the heat of the day was over. Occasional steps sounded from below. Nick, restored to his one love by the reluctant but speedy Sweet, lay a too warm but adoring weight in the crook of Rex's arm. "It was all damnable," Rex said suddenly, his cigarette glowing for an instant. "I made a hideous mistake in going." And he told G every detail he could remember. "Savardi is the Carpentier type, you know. He conquers by force. Doro does not love him. She was uncertain of life when he entered it. She had achieved so much so quickly. Of course all the future seemed flat. And she isn't the exact type. She has been too much herself in a real role to be entirely herself in an artificial one. All the while she wants something and isn't quite sure what. Really, it is just what everyone wants, to be understood. She wants to go on, and yet have a stable background. She would never acknowledge it, I suppose. Perhaps honestly she has not realized it, but what she wants is a husband like me, a man who would give her her head and keep his, give her his heart and keep hers. It's rare, I know, and I only sound conceited fool, but I could do it. If you specialize on one woman, you do get an idea of how to treat her. I've specialized on Doro through all the years that matter most. No other woman has ever awakened a fraction of feeling in me. I've wasted nothing, not from virtue or careful hoarding, but simply because I've been so held by Doro that I've concentrated almost unconsciously. I could give her life as she wants it. Savardi will take her and lose her in a year. He only wants her because she did not want him. Already he is bored by the exigence of her demand for freedom, by her entirely opposite conception of what an engagement should be. He is of his type, G, and a fine specimen at that. Big, generous, spoilt, bigoted, and selfish. And his outlook is that of his kind. He hoped, in the first instance, to make Doro his mistress. He asked for her in marriage because he recognized that chance, in the shape of father's advent, had given her the best cards. When I learnt that, I thrashed him, rather publicly. "So that is the reason," G said guardedly. She longed to take his head and press it to her heart and tell him she was proud of him, but neither of them had ever been demonstrative, and it seemed late, in every sense. She reflected with a wry smile, as the clock struck 12, to begin. "I am damn glad I did it," Rex went on unemotionally. "I suppose, once made so, or one never really deadens the primitive instinct. But there's something intensely and passionately satisfying in holding a man's body in your arms when you hate him furiously, and feeling you can beat its strength. When my back is devilish painful, I think of the moment I lifted Savardi clear and threw him, and by God, it helps me to feel better." After a pause, he said, "Of course, Doro never knew about Savardi's first feeling for her, or, naturally, about the fight." "So she'll marry him?" "Oh, yes. Probably they are married." He shifted on his pillows, and Nick cuddled closer. "You know, G, it's the most extraordinary thing, the way one envisages an empty life. I want Doro so much that I can't get a perspective of life without her. One would think love must meet a love such as mine, to make a complete thing, but it doesn't. Married, she'll be the same to me. I can't feel, shall not be able to, as men say they do, when the woman they love marries. That's as if she were dead to them. Dead! When she breathes and laughs and moves in the world, and you might see her any minute. If she were dead, you'd be at peace, and there is no peace for any lover whilst another man lives and takes his fill. I would to God I had killed Savardi, and paid for it." When his voice ceased, it was as if a brilliant tongue of flame died utterly to ash. The air had vibrated to passion. Now it was void, exhausted utterly. Jean knew she had nothing to say to him. She had never dreamt he felt, could feel, like this. She had believed his casualness signified a patient, easy love. She now discovered that tranquil self-possession to be an assumption. Below it glowed white-hot idolatry, allied, as is so often the case, to primitive instincts. It was almost impossible to imagine him fighting Savardi. It was even more strange to recognize utter truth in that headlong statement, "I wish to God I had killed Savardi and paid for it." "Oh, my dear," G said wearily. Rex gave a short laugh, meant to convey comfort, to lighten the impression of his last words. "It's all right," he said hurriedly. They spoke of other things, but G went to her room, fighting an intense depression. Life itself seemed empty, as ashen as that moment when Rex's voice had ceased, and silence swathed them in its numb folds. End of Part 2 of Chapter 22. Recording by mlcui. Chapter 23 of Almond-Blossom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Almond-Blossom by Olive WADSLEY. Chapter 23. My heart was winter-bound until I heard you sing. O voice of love, hush not, but fill my life with spring. My hopes were homeless things before I saw your eyes. O smile of love, close not the door to paradise. My dreams were bitter ones, and then I found them bliss. O lips of love, give me again your rose to kiss. Springtide of love, the secret sweet is ours alone. O heart of love, at last you beat against my own. Frank Dempster Sherman. Savardi told nothing, and learnt with vast relief that Rex had left Madrid, and with even greater satisfaction that he likewise had kept silence. He had not entirely believed that he would speak. That much honour he paid him. But the subtlety which he chose sometimes to make appear a veneer for his real self, but which in reality lay at the core of his nature, influenced by heritage and cultivated by choice, had long since urged him to distrust the actions of any man who was his rival. He hated Rex implacably for beating him and loving Doro. He respected him only because he had, as he thought, discretion. That Rex had gone because his love was greater than his hatred, and his consideration for the woman he adored stronger than both, he never imagined. That type of affection did not enter his code. He himself went to Doro early, because his headlong infatuation for her allowed him to suffer any anguish rather than suspense, and he found after a few minutes' speech that she was entirely ignorant of the evening's debacle. Doro told him Rex had left suddenly, and he made no comment whatever. He had always believed in sparing lies, and indeed in never lying unless the occasion was an essential one. Now he put an arm round Doro and kissed her, then gave her the gift he had brought, either as an offering of devotion or an atonement. In any case, it was quite a beautiful mantilla, and had the arms of the family woven into the design. After the observation that the eldest-born daughter of the eldest son was christened in the Vale, Savardi launched into an impassioned plea for the date of their marriage. Almost coincidentally, Averardo entered, brandishing a London contract just arrived, and bristling with exuberant triumph. It was scarcely the moment for this announcement, and Savardi, his bruised face flushing darkly, broke into a torrent of exasperated speech. Averardo listened equably, bowed, and went out after a long glance at Doro. As the door closed, Savardi had her in his arms. "Madre de Dios, does it never seem to you that I feel anything? Do you not care what I suffer? I wait and wait on your word, and you do not give it. A little actor-manager offers you a contract, and you will sign at once, and no matter when our marriage takes place. You must not, you shall not. It is impossible, I tell you, impossible." He released her to gesticulate with eloquence, his blue eyes narrowed in anger, his mobile mouth quivering. I love you, he said vehemently. "You are my affianced wife. All that I have I will give you to make up for this career you must renounce. God in heaven, what will our life be if you forever sing?" And suddenly he was at her feet, adoring, humble, his ardent face almost timorous. She could not love him so little that she could sacrifice his love for a song. Ah, he adored her like a saint, like a flame. Feel. His heart leapt against her hand under the thin silk shirt. And out of a whirl of kisses, supplication, anger, despair, wildest adoration, he was gone. I must make some decision, Doro told herself wretchedly, and again she longed for Rex, his impartiality, the sense of cool support he gave somehow. She must choose one way or the other, and if she chose a career, what then? Just a career. If she chose marriage, well, a devotion, someone to belong to laugh with, a sharer of life. But if Savardi had only been willing to share her life a little. I want the impossible, she told herself with bleak truth. A man who will let me be myself, and his as well. Suddenly, in the midst of settling up the end of the season, arranging the future, disputing it, Tony's old enemy, malaria, claimed him. He was ordered back to England immediately. Savardi, secretly furious, could do no less than commiserate, and agree that Doro must accompany him. Tony had never imagined she would not. Savardi and he had one quality at least in common, a superb selfishness. Averardo travelled too to London, enacting, as a matter of course, his John the Baptist role, his rendering of it shining out with special success at railway stations and on the way to the dining car. He said nothing of work, but his soul exulted that he and Doro would be in London at the same time. Covent Garden was his Mecca and paradise, and each mile nearer to it filled him with joy. Savardi left them at Paris. He was to fetch Doro later. As he stood on the ugly, dark Gare du Nord platform, bareheaded, smiling at Doro, he seemed very securely young and self-confident. Their hands clasped, Savardi sighed with Spanish sentiment, and his blue eyes glittered for a second as his glance crossed that of an extremely pretty midinette tripping towards the barrier. "I shall think every minute only of you until we meet," he said to Doro. The train, already moving, caught his words and crushed them in its jaws of noise. Savardi turned away and began to walk swiftly. Doro watched him, and as she did, so she seemed to lose the impression she had had of him so long, and he became, mysteriously, merely a good-looking young man in search of adventure. The parting brought, as it often does, reaction. Now it seemed possible to feel a sense of an, paradoxically, oppressive relief. At any rate, the journey had begun, and that meant respite from farewells, from protestations. For a little while now she could rest, safe from adoration or adjuration. "I am impossible," she told herself with chagrin. "I accept without gratitude, and yet want without knowledge, and am all the time dissatisfied because I am not understood." Throughout the journey that sense of harassing futility held her. For self-comfort she adopted the creed of reaction and overtiredness, and found in neither any real satisfaction or any antidote to her mood of lethargic inappreciation. Even being in town again gave her no quickening pulse. Victoria looked as if she had never left it, or rather just as she had left it years before. The Stafford Hotel, whither Tony decreed they should go for the night, was as exclusive and imposing as ever. The same heat haze hung over the streets of dusk as had hung that other summer. "I'm off to bed early, my dear," Tony announced. "Suppose you'll not be late?" "I'll sit up a little longer, I think," Doro answered. She carried a chair to the window and lay back in it, gazing at the stars. Tomorrow, Hurst Point and Rex. What was Savardi doing now? Had he caught up the pretty girl with the arched eyebrows? How many women became engaged because it seemed the easiest thing to do, from a desire of conquest, or that fatal and cruel kindness which actually springs from vanity, and, whilst declaring its foundation to be an inability to hurt, cloaks its real mainspring of existence. She supposed Savardi and she would settle down. Life seemed singularly meaningless in some ways. One took what came because it came. She clasped her hands behind her head. Had every atom of fire really burnt out of her after Pan's death? London brought him back so nearly, and this memory made her feel very lonely, reached certain depths in her which responded with an aching sadness. Savardi's love had touched her superficially, but that touch had laid open the way for this deeper feeling. Oh, once again, if only for a little while, to feel even a fraction of that wildly sweet emotion she had felt before. Oh, for something, for someone, to matter vividly, beyond all telling. Savardi was marrying her because he could gain her no other way, after a frustrated effort to escape the tie. She smiled bitterly in the starry darkness. She was so modern, so accepting of all things, that she could smile. Oh heavens, how much one is influenced by nothing at all, she told herself with sad amusement. Blankness of life had made her encourage Savardi, and only weakness prevented her breaking with him. Tonight life seemed a waste. She felt as if she were looking on a fete where she might not enter. A knock came at the door. Tony's man laid the late papers on the table. She asked if Tony had gone to sleep, bade the man good night, and, as the door closed, walked to the table and lifted a paper and opened it. A small headline drew her gaze instantly. It contained Rex's name, and below was printed the news that he was lying dangerously ill at his house in St. James's Place, and added that he was suffering from the severe after-effects of a duel. A description of Greville House followed, and Doro read it through mechanically. Her mind registered a mistake. The reporter stated the Italian frescoes were in the white drawing-room. He was wrong. The paper slid from her grasp. She stood quite still in the brilliantly lit room, and it seemed as if Rex were there visibly. Rex smiling at her, Rex angered, Rex become serious. Little personal tricks of habit which were his returned to her mind. The way he smoothed his thick, smooth, fair hair, the attitudes he adopted in big chairs. London pulsed and throbbed outside. Somewhere in the hotel a door banged. The sharp sound released Doro from her inactive self. She put a hand up to her throat to stop the fluttering of her breath. Dangerously ill. That was only written when there was no hope. It meant a person would die. She thought of Rex dead, Rex, who so loved life, and then Rex, with his sense of humour, fighting a duel. Her mind linked the day of his departure, its secrecy, his casual note of farewell, he who was so courteous a being, Savardi's bruised face and stiff arm. She gave a little stifled cry and put a clenched hand to her mouth. And in that moment she hated Savardi, because his conduct had hurt Rex, had brought Rex to this. Every atom of self-defence, of tenderness which her nature held, swung out to shield Rex. It was 11 o'clock when she reached Greville House. The door stood open. A car waited before it. Doro walked straight in, and met Rex limping from the library. She put out her hands, and he caught one and held it closely. "Hello," he said rather hoarsely. "What very happy wind blows you here?" Doro looked at him. She stammered out, her voice almost inaudible. The papers said." "That canard," Rex interpolated swiftly. His white face flushed scarlet. "Surely you didn't believe it?" He tried to laugh. "G showed it me at dinner. It's abominable. I've had it contradicted, of course. Heaven knows how these reporters think of their lies." He was talking to gain time, to recover himself. His illness had left him very weak. Doro said dully, "Nothing matters. The lies, I mean. You are here, alive, well." Her bewildered eyes rested on him piteously. "Doro," he said gently, "my dear, it's all right. Of course it gave you a shock. But now, why did you come, you yourself, I mean, so late?" She smiled at him through sudden tears. "I only knew the truth so late," she whispered. There was that in her eyes and voice a man sees and hears seldom. Rex trembled. This hope after despair. He forced himself to deny it. He dared not believe, not understand. Steps sounded. A sure instinct that they two must be alone made them enter the library and close the door. It was dark in there. The windows were open into the little private garden. A faint breeze swayed the heavy curtains slightly. Desperately, Doro said, "Why did you fight? Was it because you knew?" "I fought because I hated Savardi," Rex said with sudden hoarse ardentness. "Hated him for loving you. No man loves his fortunate rival. He may respect him if he knows him to be the better man. I knew Savardi to be a cad, and he was in my way. I longed to fight him. I am glad I did." "But I accepted his form of love, knowing," Doro murmured. You must know that. You must, and oh, I don't know. I can't explain." "You need not try," Rex said composedly. "I knew long ago. I understood. One does when one loves." She went very close to him. "I understood when I read you were ill, Rex. I knew then. It was as if I had been released from myself, from everything that clogged my steps. Do you remember, years ago, kissing me one night in Paris, and you said I should remember? I do tonight." He put an arm round her, so lightly it scarcely touched her, and yet she knew in every fibre of her being that it was there. He said, holding her in that still tenderness, "I do understand, always." His voice grew unsteady, very young somehow in its carefully restrained eagerness. "Doro, It's real, isn't it? You really love?" Still he did not kiss her. He seemed to wait, and his waiting brought to her, in some inexplicable way, the knowledge that he waited because the moment was so marvellous. Then he gave a quick boyish sigh, and whispered her name. She put out a hand and drew down his head towards her. "Oh, yes, yes," she whispered, her lips against his. "It is real, it is true. It is as if, my darling, my heart were at rest in yours at last." The End. End of chapter 23. End of Almond-Blossom by Olive WADSLEY. Recording by mlcui. Thank you for listening.